Grace to you all this morning, and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Can you believe those guys? They thought just because they were in positions of power and wealth that they owned other people, that they could exploit them, especially women, use them for their own purposes. Where does that kind of mentality come from? Can you believe them? Now, I think I caught you all just for a minute there. You know who I'm talking about? I'm talking about the men in Corinth 2,000 years ago to whom Paul is writing here in this passage. Truly, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there is nothing new under the sun. Apparently, in the society of that time, and Corinth was kind of like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, one of the prominent cities of the world at the time. Apparently, in the world at that time, it was completely acceptable for men of wealth and power to have women on the side. They didn't even hide it. And when Paul confronted them with this sinfulness, they said, well, it's legal, because it was. Hence, Paul begins this passage saying, all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. But I think you made an assumption there, that I was talking about somebody else, that I was speaking in a more contemporary fashion, and perhaps I was. But what I want to kind of think about with you today is what happens when we make assumptions and don't bring our thoughtfulness and our awareness and our faith to certain situations. Samuel, as I mentioned to the kids, was probably about 12 years old. He had been living in the temple as a servant to Eli and to God since he was 3, when his mother brought him as her dedication to God, her firstborn child, for whom she had prayed fervently. 9 years living in the temple, and one night God calls to Samuel. And Samuel, immediately when he hears this voice calling him in the night, makes an assumption. It must be Eli. An interesting detail in that story, did you notice it? Because Samuel did not yet know the Lord. Well, what was he doing for the past 9 years in the temple? Or more importantly, what was Eli, his mentor and teacher, doing? See, just because Samuel was in the temple didn't mean yet that he was a person of faith. Or as one of my colleagues said earlier this week, just because you're in church doesn't make you a Christian any more than sitting in your garage makes you a car. So there was Samuel in the temple, in the tent of meeting, serving Eli, and yet he had no knowledge of the Lord whatsoever. So when God calls to Samuel, Samuel makes an assumption that it's the voice of Eli. And when he goes to Eli and says, here I am, you called me, Eli himself makes an assumption. Either that Samuel's having a bad dream, or he's a little bit off in the head. I didn't call you, go back and lay down. 3 times they have this exchange before Eli realizes that it's God calling. Because Eli himself was in a predictable pattern of behavior. And he made certain assumptions about that. He assumed that everything was functioning normally, the way you would expect. We do it all the time. It's the way we tend to function on a daily basis. We make assumptions. It's our way of understanding and having a first contact with the world around us. Those who study the brain will tell us that our assumptions come out of the brainstem, the lower brain, that make the first decisions that are sort of immediate reactions to the world as we experience it. And that reaction from our brainstem, our lower brain, has been trained into us. Some of it is innate, but some of it is a product of our learning, so that we can survive. It's an evolutionary technique to help us survive and go on and continue to live. But what's interesting about that is that we have more of a brain than that. In fact, we have this marvelous creation of a brain inside our heads. We have the higher brain that encourages us to be thoughtful and reflective. But in times of stress and pressure in our lives, we tend to react almost totally out of our lower brain. And that's where our assumptions get made. We see something and immediately we assume we know most of the things we need to know about that situation for our own sake. So if I were to come running up to you on the street with an angry look on my face and maybe a gun in my hand, you would immediately make an assumption that I was about to attack you. That's a very safe assumption to make. But you would be disarmed by the fact, perhaps, that it was me, or that I was wearing a collar, because clergy don't act that way. So there would be a clash of your assumptions. My guess is that you would probably hunker down a little bit with this confused look on your face, because there was a conflict there between your lower brainstem, which said that this is a threat, and your higher brain that said, oh no, this is Pastor Paul. He's not going to hurt me. And I think a lot of our problems come in that conflict between the lower brain and the higher brain, where we don't let the higher brain take over. Definitely, I'm not putting down the function of the lower brain in our lives. If you see a car careening off the roads toward you, move out of the way. That's what your lower brain is telling you to do, to preserve you for another day of life. But as I said, too often in times of stress and pressure, when we're feeling really put upon and anxious, we tend to forget that we have a higher brain that can mediate the reactions of that lower brain and invite us to be more thoughtful about things. We tend, in other words, in times of anxiety and stress, to get stuck in our assumptions. "50 years ago, Dr. King was assassinated this coming April because his attacker, his assassin, made certain assumptions about what Dr. King was about and what it would do to the world in which he lived. And out of his lower brain, he decided that that threat to his own existence, as he perceived it, needed to be removed. How often this is a result of us thinking only with our lower brains. Remove the threat at whatever cost so that I can survive to live another day. How often we make assumptions about what's going on without ever stepping back for a moment, even in times of peace, to be more thoughtful about what's happening. Jesus is about gathering disciples. People whom one way we can understand who those disciples are. They're people that Jesus is inviting to relate to him in a way that will make them more thoughtful, more faithful, to calm down long enough in their lives to hear the voice of God giving them direction and purpose and meaning. Jesus calls Philip. Philip goes to his friend Nathanael and says to him in his great excitement, "We have found him about whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets." And Nathanael, when he finds out that Jesus comes from Nazareth, says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Nathanael immediately makes an assumption about Jesus based on his place of birth. Has that ever happened to you? I went to seminary in Chicago. Marion and I married in May and moved to Chicago in September. For those of you who are not aware of this, geographically, Chicago is in the Midwest. As were about 99% of our classmates. For many of them who were not from Chicago itself, but from places like Nebraska and Iowa, Marion and I were the first New Yorkers they had ever met. I kid you not, it was almost like they wanted to touch us to make sure that we had survived to the age of 22 growing up in New York City. You've never been murdered or mugged? Apparently not. But the assumption was, because we had come from Nazareth, New York, can anything good come out of New York and live? They had reacted out of their assumptions about what it meant to be a New Yorker, which we supported, or I did anyway, by my accent, of which I thought I had none. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And if Nathanael had stayed in that place of assumption, he never would have had the ability to have his life transformed, as we know from later in the Gospels it is, by his encounter with Jesus. If he had stayed in that place that said, I've got it all figured out, I know exactly who this person is and what he's about, he never would have had that transformative experience with the one that Philip so boldly says to him is the one that Moses had written about in the law and the prophets. We get caught on our assumptions all the time, don't we? We sometimes get so stuck in them that we don't allow ourselves to be transformed into a new way of thinking. And as I mentioned, that's because that's our lower brain functioning to help us survive. But that lower brain also encourages us to draw the world around ourselves smaller and smaller. Because the smaller our world, the safer it is. The less interesting, but the safer, the more predictable, the more manageable. That's the idea. That lower brain is called by brain scientists our reptilian brain. Because for reptiles, think snakes, iguanas, like that, that's all they've got. They don't have any cortex. They've just got a brain that reacts. And you can imagine that when you think about a reptile who perceives a threat and immediately they move. Because there's no cortex to help them think about what they might mean. They're just trying to survive. But I want to suggest to you that our cortex, that amazing part of our brain that helps us to think and create and to do wonderful things, is a gift from God through which God invites us into relationship in a particular way. And that is to be thoughtful not only about God's presence in our lives, but about our relationships with other people. Maybe especially the stranger who is often perceived as a threat. And we go from the story of Samuel, which is assumptions are being made all over the place, and we go to the story of Jesus meeting Nathanael, and assumptions are being made there, and we hear about Paul talking about what happens when you make assumptions. Well, it's legal, so it must be okay, and I'm not going to question it. To that beautiful psalm that talks about how deep God is, and how deep God's knowledge of us is, and how God makes no assumptions about us because God doesn't need to, right? God doesn't need to make assumptions because God knows already everything about us. God's knowledge of us, when we were still being knit together in our mother's womb, the psalmist says, is more intimate of us than we are of ourselves. In other words, God knows me better than I know me. And the same is true for you. I wonder how you feel about that. I wonder what kind of assumptions you're making in light of that knowledge. Is it an immediate reptilian defensiveness of like, oh no, God knows that? Because the good news is that God knows all of that about you, about me, and loves us still. Loves us anyway. Continues to love us. God invites us into a relationship in which we don't have to be defensive and frightened. I know you remember this, that when angels come to speak to God's people, the number one message they give before they go on with the rest of what they have to say is, don't be afraid. Because often in confrontation with the holy God, our reaction is to be defensive about that. But the angels say, speaking God's words, don't be afraid. I already know everything there is to know about you. And I still love you. Think about that kind of a gift, right, sisters and brothers? I know everything there is to know about you, and I still love you. And hopefully the knowledge and growing into the knowledge and the awareness and the experience of that love, which is available to us all the time, helps us to not be afraid and to get out of our lower brain into our more thoughtful brain that looks at the world around us in a different way. That looks at the world around us as a world that is shot through with the presence of God. And that invites us to have our eyes and our ears and our hearts open to detect that presence, most notably and especially in one another. And by one another, I don't just mean the people gathered here, right? And I don't just mean the people that are family and friends. I don't just mean the people that live in Westchester. And on and on and on. I mean all of God's creation. In the human creation and in the natural world, God is present. And to be able to see God's presence in the face of the other, however different, however strange. I think that's what Paul is talking about there in Corinthians. He says, look, you're going to become the person that you are most connected to. He says, and God has created us for relationship with God. Now, when you take that relationship and you give it to somebody else in an unhealthy way, then you're not prepared to recognize God where God is because your focus is everywhere else. Sure, that practice might be legal back in that time, not in this, but it's not beneficial. Which almost sounds like, when Paul says it, almost sounds like not enough. But then he says, not only isn't it beneficial, but it takes your heart away. You weren't created for that. You were created for healthy relationships with God and with one another. So I want to encourage you to let go of some of those assumptions that color our understanding and engagement with the world. And the way we do that is through the way of trust. God will never lead us into anything that God and we can't handle together. Long before he was assassinated, Dr. King knew the trajectory of his life. He figured that he would never make it to the conclusion or the fulfillment of his efforts towards civil rights. He said, I may not get to the promised land. He knew where things were going. He knew the reaction of people who would assume things about him. He had his own life and the life of his family threatened and attacked on a number of occasions. And yet, even in the midst of that, he did not back down, but maintained his trust in God to lead him forward, not only for his own sake, but for the sake of the whole world in which he lived. That we would lead better lives if we stopped assuming the negative about one another and instead were thoughtful enough to see the image of God in one another. Remember? That was his dream, in which we don't judge people by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. To react to the color of a person's skin, or to their political ideology, or to their gender, or to any of those other identifiers, is to react totally out of the reptilian brain. But to react to another person based on the content of their character, on the depth of how much God has blessed them, on the image of God within them, that is a product of our divine thoughtfulness. God calls us to that higher way of life. God calls us to loving thoughtfulness in our engagement with one another. I like what Thea said. Can it even be little things? It's almost always little things, isn't it? For us, it begins with those little things and grows from there. So in this week, in your engagement with the world and those around you, do the little things of love. Step back from that tendency to judge and make assumptions and react out of the faithfulness of God joining us together as family. See in one another the image of God. Know that God knows you and loves you, and practice that love in your life in the little ways, in the meaningful ways. Amen.